Before you scroll past, subscribe, like, and comment, because what happened behind these concrete walls was buried for years, and once you hear it, you won't forget it. The alarm didn't scream the way people imagine alarms do. Inside a high-security prison, it thudded, low, mechanical, final, echoing through steel corridors already soaked in tension. Red lights pulsed against blue-gray concrete as cell doors slammed shut one after another, a rolling thunder of metal that turned the entire cell block into a locked coffin. Prison guards moved fast, boots striking the floor in tight formation, hands hovering near radios and cuffs. This was a prison lockdown, and it wasn't scheduled. In cell block D, the smell of sweat, disinfectant, and rust hung heavy. Inmates with tattoos, ink crawling up necks, down knuckles, across shaved scalps, stood frozen behind bars, eyes sharp, bodies still. Everyone knew something had gone wrong. Nobody knew how bad it was yet. In cell D17, a 19-year-old sat on the lower bunk, his back straight, jaw clenched. His name was Marcus Hale. Fresh ink still darkened his forearms, crude but deliberate, symbols of loyalty, rage, and survival scratched into skin too young to carry them. He had entered this USA prison 6 months earlier with a sentence that sounded temporary on paper but felt endless in reality. Armed robbery. No prior adult convictions. A teenager dropped into a high-security prison meant for men who had already learned how to disappear parts of themselves. Marcus heard the boots before he saw the shadows. A flashlight beam cut across his cell, lingering on the tattoos, the clenched fists, the eyes that refused to look away. A guard barked his number. Another guard said nothing, just stared, as if memorizing his face for later. That silence was worse. Down the tier, someone shouted that a cell had been found open. Another voice claimed prison surveillance had gone dark for 3 minutes. 3 minutes that didn't exist in official logs. In a place where every second was counted, 3 missing minutes were an eternity. The guard sealed the tier and pulled one inmate at a time for questioning. Inmate interrogation in lockdown conditions was never gentle. Men with tattooed faces were pressed against walls, wrists cuffed, questions fired like warnings. Who'd moved? Who'd spoken? Who'd seen what after lights out? Marcus was pulled third. The interrogation room was small, painted a tired gray, camera blinking red in the corner. A table bolted to the floor. 2 chairs. The hum of fluorescent lights that never quite stopped buzzing. A prison guard stood by the door. Another leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching Marcus like a problem he hadn't solved yet. They asked about the night count, about the noise in the vent system, about the inmate in D22, an older man with heavy tattoos and a reputation for knowing how things worked behind the walls. Marcus answered carefully. He had learned fast that words were currency here, and spending the wrong ones could get you buried in solitary confinement or worse. What were you doing between 2:10 and 2:13 a.m.? One guard asked. Marcus swallowed. He knew the time because everyone did. Those were the missing minutes. I was in my cell, he said. Like everyone else. The guard studied him, eyes narrowing. Criminal psychology wasn't just for textbooks. It lived here, in pauses, in breath patterns, in who spoke too fast, and who spoke not enough. They sent him back without charges, but not without consequence. By morning, the cell block buzzed with rumor. A real prison escape attempt. A breach that shouldn't have been possible. An inmate transferred out under a sheet, alive or dead, depending on who you asked. Prison gangs, never named directly, always implied, were said to be circling the truth, looking for someone to blame. Marcus felt it immediately. The looks changed. Tattooed inmates who had ignored him before now watched him too closely. One brushed past in the corridor and whispered, "You were there," like an accusation disguised as a fact. That afternoon, the prison yard stayed empty. Surveillance cameras tracked nothing but concrete and razor wire. Investigators arrived, plainclothes, serious, carrying folders thick with incident reports. A jail investigation had begun, and everyone inside knew what that meant. Lockdowns would stretch longer. Food trays would arrive cold. Solitary confinement would fill up fast with men who knew nothing or knew too much. That night, Marcus lay awake listening to the prison breathe. Pipes clanked. Distant shouting echoed, then stopped. Somewhere, a door opened that shouldn't have, then slammed shut hard enough to rattle the tier. He stared at the underside of the bunk above him, at carved initials and faded ink, and wondered how fast a life could change when the system decided to look your way. Just before morning count, a guard stopped at his cell, slid a piece of paper through the slot without a word. It was a still image from prison surveillance. Grainy, blue-gray, two figures near a service corridor. One face blurred, the other unmistakable. Marcus's tattoos were visible even in low resolution, and written across the top, in block letters, were the words, "Person of Interest." The lockdown siren rolled through the prison like a slow-moving wave, heavy and unavoidable. It wasn't loud in the way chaos usually announced itself. It was controlled, deliberate, engineered to remove choice. Steel doors slammed shut in sequence, each impact echoing down the corridor until the sound stacked on itself and became something suffocating. Red indicator lights blinked on above every cell, bathing the concrete in a cold, warning glow that mixed with the prison's permanent blue-toned gloom. This was a high-security prison built to eliminate unpredictability. Every movement was logged. Every corridor watched. Every inmate counted and recounted. And yet, something had slipped through. Cell block D froze. Tattooed inmates stood motionless behind bars, muscles tense beneath loose uniforms. Ink wrapped around throats, climbed forearms, disappeared under collars. Marks of past loyalties, prison gangs, dead friends, and silent promises. No one spoke. In prison, silence during lockdown wasn't fear. It was strategy. Marcus Hale sat on the lower bunk of D-17, hands clasped, knuckles white. At 19, he was one of the youngest inmates in the block, but the tattoos on his arms aged him fast. The ink was new, still sharp, still dark, symbols he'd chosen not out of belief, but necessity. Inside a USA prison, blank skin was a liability. He had arrived 6 months earlier, shackled at the ankles, eyes forward, heart pounding harder than he would ever admit. Armed robbery. No one injured. A bad decision layered on top of a bad upbringing. The judge called it accountability. The system called it intake. Marcus called it the moment his life split in two. The siren cut off abruptly. That was worse. Silence meant guards were moving. Boots hit the corridor in tight rhythm. Prison guards advanced in pairs, radios clipped high, eyes alert. One stopped at D-22. Another peered into D-19. Flashlight beams swept across tattooed faces, lingering just long enough to remind everyone who controlled the light. Someone down the tier coughed. A guard snapped his head in that direction. Then came the voice. Count discrepancy in D block. The words traveled faster than sound. A count discrepancy meant one thing. Someone was missing, misplaced, or somewhere they shouldn't be. In a facility designed to prevent a real prison escape, that wasn't just a problem, it was a crisis. Marcus felt it before he understood it. The pressure, the shift, the way the air itself seemed to tighten. He'd learned quickly that prison had instincts, and tonight, those instincts were screaming. A lieutenant appeared at the end of the corridor, flanked by 2 officers and a handheld tablet displaying live prison surveillance. The screen flickered once, twice, then stabilized. "Lock it down," the lieutenant said. Full sweep. Metal grated as secondary barriers slid into place. No movement between blocks. No yard access. No showers. No phones. This wasn't routine. This was damage control. In D-22, an older inmate with heavy facial tattoos sat calmly on his bunk, eyes forward. His name was Elias Crow. Everyone knew him, not because he was loud, but because he wasn't. Crow had been inside longer than Marcus had been alive. He understood systems. He understood guards. He understood timing. And now, his cell door was open. The discovery came fast. Too fast. A guard froze mid-step, hand tightening on his radio. Another officer stepped back instinctively, scanning corners that hadn't changed in decades. "Cells compromised," the guard said. Word spread instantly, not through mouths, but through looks. Tattooed inmates leaned closer to bars, eyes sharp, calculating. A cell didn't just open itself, and Crow didn't make mistakes. Marcus's stomach dropped. Crow had spoken to him 2 nights earlier. Nothing obvious, nothing threatening, just a quiet question during rec time about Marcus's background, where he was from, how old he really was. Marcus had answered carefully. Now, the prison was holding its breath. Guards moved on Crow's cell first. They checked vents. They checked the toilet housing. They checked behind the bunk. No body, no blood, no signs of struggle, just absence. That was worse than violence. Within minutes, investigators were notified. External. Federal. This wasn't an internal disciplinary issue anymore. This was a jail investigation with consequences that stretched beyond the razor wire. Marcus didn't move when his cell door opened. "Hail," a guard said. "Step out. Hands behind your back. Face the wall. Tattoos visible." Procedure mattered now more than ever. He felt cuffs close around his wrists, cold and impersonal. The corridor smelled like metal and adrenaline. They took him to interrogation before breakfast. The room was small, windowless, and deliberately uncomfortable. A table bolted to the floor. A single camera mounted high. 2 chairs. One guard by the door. Another leaning against the wall, arms crossed, eyes never leaving Marcus's face. "Time," one of them said, checking his watch. They didn't read him rights. This wasn't court. This was containment. "What do you know about Crow?" the investigator asked. Marcus chose his words slowly. Criminal psychology wasn't theory here. It was survival. "I know what everyone knows," he said. "He keeps to himself." "What did he ask you 2 nights ago?" Marcus hesitated. The guard noticed. "He asked how old I was. And how long I had." The investigator nodded slightly, like that confirmed something already suspected. "What were you doing between 2:10 and 2:13 a.m.?" There it was again. The missing minutes. Prison surveillance logs showed nothing. Cameras glitched. Motion sensors stalled. 3 minutes erased inside a system built to remember everything. "I was in my cell," Marcus said. "Asleep." "Anyone see you?" No, they let the silence stretch. Silence in interrogation was a weapon. Marcus stared at the table, at the scratches carved by men who had sat here before him, each one believing they were different. "You know what solitary confinement does to a 19-year-old? The guard asked quietly. Marcus looked up. The guard's eyes weren't cruel. They were matter of fact. "I've seen kids come out different," the guard continued. "If they come out at all." Marcus said nothing. They sent him back without charges, but the damage was done. By afternoon, the entire prison knew his name. Tattooed inmates watched him from across the tier. Prison gangs didn't ask questions directly. They observed. They waited. They let pressure do the work. Someone bumped his shoulder in line and whispered, "You talk too much." Marcus didn't respond. The yard remained closed. Meals arrived late and cold. Guards rotated more frequently. Rifles appeared in places they hadn't been before. The prison was bracing for something. That night, the power flickered. Just once. Enough to unsettle everyone. Marcus lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening to distant shouting echo down and used corridors. Somewhere, a door slammed hard enough to rattle the bars. Somewhere else, a man screamed, then went silent. At 3:17 a.m., Boots stopped outside D-17. A guard slipped something through the slot in the door. Marcus picked it up slowly. A printed still from prison surveillance. Grainy, blue-toned. 2 figures near a restricted service corridor. One blurred, one unmistakable. His tattoos were visible even through the distortion. At the top of the page, stamped in block letters, "Person of Interest." Marcus sat back on his bunk as the weight of it settled in. He had entered prison at 19, and whatever had happened in those missing minutes was about to change everything. The prison didn't announce the end of the investigation. It never did. Things simply shifted, quietly, the way they always did when the truth got too close to places it wasn't meant to reach. The movement began just after the second count. Marcus Hale was escorted out of holding under tighter security than he'd ever seen. For prison guards instead of 2, radios open, hands never far from restraints. Tattooed inmates lining the corridor watched him pass, without expression. No whispers. No signals. That silence wasn't respect. It was calculation. Something was about to break. Deep inside the facility, beyond the public-facing cell blocks, the forgotten parts of the prison came alive. Maintenance corridors that hadn't appeared on official maps in years were reopened under armed supervision. Surveillance cameras were repositioned. Logs were audited line by line. Every badge swipe, every uniform issue, every unexplained absence was pulled into a growing digital web. Crow had designed his disappearance to look like an escape. That was the misdirection. He hadn't gone out. He'd gone deeper. Investigators finally reconstructed it, not as a single event, but as a sequence of favors, oversights, and silences layered over years. Crow had learned which prison guards rotated predictably, which maintenance uniforms weren't tracked closely after overnight shifts, which supervisors trusted paper logs more than live surveillance. He never rushed. He never forced anything. He waited. The blue maintenance uniform scrap found in Lane's hand hadn't been a mistake. It was leverage. Lane had known too much. Enough to be dangerous. Enough to panic when pressure increased. Enough to die quietly in a place where quiet deaths were easier to explain. When they found Crow, it wasn't dramatic. No alarms. No chase. He was sitting in a sealed storage annex beneath the old infirmary wing, a space once used for archived medical equipment and later forgotten. He looked calm, older than when he'd vanished. His tattooed hands rested neatly on his knees, ink faded but unmistakable, years of time written into skin. He didn't resist. He didn't deny anything either. Crow spoke during interrogation the way men do when they've already won something important. "I didn't run," he said evenly. "I proved I could." The cooperating guard was arrested the same day. No public spectacle, just a quiet removal from duty, escorted past colleagues who suddenly understood why integrity mattered more than routine. The guard never looked back. His tattoos, once hidden beneath regulation sleeves, were photographed and cataloged like evidence instead of identity. Charges followed: corruption, obstruction, facilitation. Crow was transferred under federal authority before dawn, destination classified. The prison released a statement about internal security enhancements and procedural reviews. No mention of how close the system had come to losing control of itself. Inside the walls, the response was immediate. Lockdowns eased. Surveillance normalized. Solitary confinement doors reopened one by one. Prison gangs recalibrated silently, shifting alliances away from chaos and toward stability. Men with tattoos returned to routine because routine was survival. Marcus Hale was moved again. This time, it was permanent. Lower security wing. Different tier. Fewer eyes. The federal investigator met him once more before leaving the facility. "You were collateral," she said honestly. "That's not the same as innocent, but it's not guilt either." Marcus nodded. He understood systems better now. "Your sentence won't change," she added. "But your trajectory might." She stood, then paused. "Crow didn't pick you because you were weak," she said. "He picked you because you were forgettable to the system." That stayed with Marcus. Weeks passed. Life inside prison always moved forward, even when nothing really changed. Marcus adjusted. He kept his head down. His tattoos faded slightly under institutional soap and time, but he never covered them. Inside these walls, erasing yourself was more dangerous than being seen. Sometimes, late at night, he'd hear maintenance carts roll down distant corridors and feel his chest tighten. Other times, he'd catch his reflection in the scratched steel mirror and barely recognize the 19-year-old who entered months earlier. He wasn't that person anymore. The prison still stood. The walls still held. Surveillance still watched. But one thing had shifted permanently. The illusion of control was gone. Because everyone inside now understood the truth. That even in a high-security prison, even under constant surveillance, even with systems designed to eliminate unpredictability, it only took one man who understood the cracks to expose how fragile it all really was. Marcus Hale entered prison at 19. What happened next didn't just shock everyone. It changed how the prison watched itself. And somewhere, deep beneath the concrete and steel, there remained a space that had once hidden a man who proved the system could be beaten, not with violence, not with escape, but with patience. If this prison case stunned you, the next one will be even darker. Subscribe so you don't miss it. The prison didn't react to the discovery in the utility closet with noise or panic. It reacted with cold, hard precision. By the time most inmates were waking up for the morning count, the service corridor had been completely sealed off behind layered security gates. Every single one was logged. Every single one was watched. Guards stood posted at intersections they usually just walked through without a second glance. In a temporary command room set up near the administration offices, surveillance monitors glowed, looping the same 30-second clip over and over again. You could see boots entering the frame, a shadow pausing, then 7 seconds of pure static, and then movement resuming like nothing had ever happened. Those 7 seconds had just become the most dangerous span of time inside the entire facility. The inmate found dead was a man named Robert Lane. His tattoos told a story you see a lot in prison. Unfinished dates, names crossed out, symbols that had been altered over time to signal survival instead of belief. He wasn't a powerful guy. He wasn't protected by any major group. He was, for lack of a better word, useful. And now he was gone. The official reports were careful with their language. They called it a medical episode. No visible trauma. An ongoing review. But inside the walls, nobody believed a single word of it. Marcus Hale felt the change in the atmosphere almost immediately. The general pressure that always hangs in the air of a prison had suddenly narrowed, tightening around specific people, specific movements, specific moments in time. He noticed it in the way guards lingered near his cell, not aggressively, but with an intense attentiveness. He noticed it in the way the heavily tattooed inmates no longer whispered when he walked past. Now they just watched him. And in here, watching meant waiting. He was pulled from his cell mid-morning. They didn't escort him to interrogation, but to a small interview room just off the medical wing. This place felt different. It was cleaner, quieter. There wasn't a visible camera, though Marcus knew better than to believe that. There was always a camera. The federal investigator was already sitting there. She didn't bother to introduce herself again. She didn't need to. "You recognize the uniform?" she asked, sliding a sealed evidence photo across the table toward him. Marcus glanced down. It was blue fabric with a frayed edge. A maintenance issue stamp was barely visible. "I've seen it," he said flatly. "Everyone has." "Who wears it?" she pressed. "Maintenance crews," Marcus listed. "Some guards during the overnight rotations. Inmates assigned to cleaning details." "Did Crow ever wear it?" Marcus hesitated. That short pause said everything. "Not officially," he finally admitted. "But he could get access to one." The investigator nodded slowly, as if confirming something she already suspected. "Crow understood systems," she said. "That's consistent with what we've seen." She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. "What's not consistent," she continued, her voice low, "is why a 19-year-old ends up on camera during a breach that required meticulous planning, high-level access, and absolute silence." Marcus clenched his jaw. "I didn't plan anything," he said, his voice tight. "I know," she replied calmly. "That's why you're still here." She tapped the screen of her tablet, and a diagram appeared. It was old blueprints of the prison, from before the last renovation, highlighting service corridors that didn't appear on any of the official maps anymore. "These tunnels were decommissioned years ago," she explained. "Or at least, that's what the records say. But Crow knew about them. Lane knew about them. And someone on staff either forgot they existed or chose to forget." Marcus stared at the labyrinth of lines on the screen. "You were used," she said, her voice devoid of any emotion. "We just don't know how yet." Back in his block, the consequences were already unfolding, and they were unfolding fast. 2 inmates were removed from D Block without any explanation. Rumor had it one of them was cooperating with the investigators. The other had just been in the wrong place at the wrong time, too often. The heavy doors of solitary confinement slammed shut, sealing men away into a quiet that either lasted for days or broke them in a matter of hours. The prison gangs tightened up internally. There were no more meetings, no gatherings in the yard. Everything was communicated through signals. Who sat where at meal times, who ate last, who stood up when a certain guard walked by. Tattoos that once proudly broadcasted affiliation now felt like dangerous liabilities. Luis Calderon reappeared during the evening count, standing at the bars of the cell directly across from Marcus's. "You're still breathing," Calderon said, his voice just a quiet murmur. "That means someone wants you that way." Marcus didn't respond, just stared straight ahead. "Crow was planning something much bigger than an escape," Calderon continued. "Escape was just leverage. The rest of it, that was insurance." Marcus finally looked over at him. "Insurance for what?" Calderon's eyes flicked upward, toward the ceiling, toward the ever-present cameras. "For people on the outside," he said, "and for 1 or 2 people on the inside who forgot where the lines were supposed to be drawn." The implication of his words landed like a physical blow. Corruption didn't need a lot of participants. It just needed the right ones. That night, the prison went dark again, but not completely. Emergency lighting kicked in, washing the long corridors in deep, eerie blue shadows. You could hear the low hum of generators kicking to life. The official explanation came later: routine electrical testing. Unofficially, everyone knew it was something else. In the maintenance wing, investigators discovered a secondary access panel, hidden behind stacks of dusty supplies. It didn't lead out of the prison. It led deeper into it, into spaces forgotten by renovations and ignored by routine security checks. The kind of hidden spaces a guy like Crow would have mapped out in his head over the years. And someone else had been there very recently. There were boot prints in the dust. Fresh ones. Just before dawn, Marcus was removed from his cell again, escorted under heavy guard through corridors he'd never even seen before. He passed closed doors, reinforced walls, hearing the muffled sounds of men shouting from inside the isolation units. He was brought to a small holding room right next to the sealed-off corridor. The investigator was standing there with two senior prison officials, the tension in the room so thick you could feel it in their stillness. "We found Crow's trail," she said, getting straight to the point. "But not his body." Marcus's heart started pounding in his chest. "He didn't escape," she continued. "He disappeared inside the system." She paused for effect. "And someone helped him do it." One of the prison officials shifted uncomfortably on his feet. "We believe the help came from a maintenance rotation," the investigator said, her gaze fixed on Marcus. "Uniform access, heat clearance, short windows of opportunity." Marcus thought of the blue fabric in the evidence photo, the 7 missing seconds on the camera footage. Robert Lane's clenched fist. "You want me to identify someone," Marcus stated. It wasn't a question. "We want you to survive," she replied coolly. Those two things might just overlap. They showed him a lineup of faces on the tablet: guards, civilian staff, contracted workers. One of the images made his chest tighten. It was the guard who had warned him weeks earlier, the one with the tired eyes and old scars on his face. Marcus didn't say a word. "Take your time," the investigator said. "But you need to understand this. The longer Crow stays hidden inside these walls, the more dangerous this situation gets. For everyone." Marcus looked back at the screen, at the familiar face, and the full weight of the situation finally settled in. Crow hadn't vanished. He had positioned himself, and the very walls that were supposed to keep everyone in were now hiding someone who knew exactly how to use them as a weapon. The door behind Marcus locked with a heavy, final thud. And somewhere, deep inside the prison's forgotten spaces, something, or someone, was moving again. The pressure inside the prison didn't explode, it tightened. That was how the system worked when it wanted results without the chaos. By the third day, Cell Block C felt hostile in a way Marcus Hale couldn't quite explain. He'd been moved again, quietly, with no paperwork, into an older wing where tattooed inmates spoke less and watched more. The walls here felt narrower, the air heavier, the men seasoned. This wasn't a place for mistakes, and Marcus knew it. He kept his routine sharp. Eat fast. Walk straight. Don't linger. Still, eyes followed him everywhere. The prison gangs didn't confront him directly. They measured him. At evening chow, a man sat across from him without asking. His name was Luis Calderon. His tattoos were dense, deliberate, layered with years of survival. "You're being tested," Calderon said, his voice calm, cutting through the low hum of the mess hall. Marcus just stared at his food. "Crow didn't want to escape," Calderon continued. "He wanted to prove something." Marcus remained silent, not daring to look up. "That's why you're still breathing," Calderon added, a final, chilling note before he stood up and walked away. "For now." The words hung in the air long after he was gone. Marcus finished his meal, his appetite gone, the food tasting like ash in his mouth. That same night, the prison's surveillance system flagged another irregularity. It wasn't a full blackout this time, just a stutter. 11 seconds of footage missing near the old service corridor. It was too precise to be random, and the investigators noticed it immediately. The gears of the official investigation were turning, but inside the walls, something much faster and more brutal was taking over. Fear began to replace rumor. One inmate, who had been vocal about what he thought happened to Crow, suddenly vanished into solitary confinement after changing his story. Another was taken to the medical wing with a supposed illness and was never seen again. The tattooed men who once talked freely now guarded their silence like it was contraband, their eyes darting nervously whenever a guard walked by. Then, Marcus was called back for questioning. He walked into the sterile room, the air cold, and sat opposite the federal investigator. She didn't accuse him this time. Instead, she explained. "You weren't the plan," she said, her tone professional, but edged with something he couldn't quite place. "You were the signal." She slid a photograph across the table, a clearer image than before. It showed the corridor, the night of Crow's disappearance. And there, a third figure in a blue maintenance uniform, their posture eerily familiar, their face half hidden in the shadows. Marcus recognized it instantly. A jolt went through him, a cold wave of understanding. But he kept his face a perfect mask of indifference. He said nothing. He couldn't. Back in his cell, the pressure turned deeply personal. A note appeared under his mattress, crudely written on a scrap of paper. 2 words, keep quiet. It wasn't a suggestion, it was an order. The message was reinforced during rec time. A heavily tattooed inmate shoulder-checked him, hard enough to bruise, sending him stumbling against the chain-link fence. The man leaned in close, his breath hot and smelling of stale coffee. "You don't want to be remembered," he whispered, his voice a low growl, before melting back into the crowd of orange jumpsuits. The threat was clear. Forgetting was survival. Remembering was a death sentence. And then, everything stopped. The prison went into full emergency lockdown. Sirens blared, blue lights flashed against the gray walls, and steel doors slammed shut, sealing everyone inside. For hours, no one knew what was happening. The air grew thick with tension, with unspoken questions. Later, the reason spread quietly, passed from cell to cell in hushed whispers. A heavily tattooed inmate, one of the enforcers who kept the unofficial order, had been found dead. He was discovered in a utility closet right near the same service corridor where Crow had vanished. The official cause of death would be listed as natural causes. No one inside believed it for a second. Investigators sealed the area, their faces grim. The atmosphere in the prison shifted from tense to volatile. Everyone knew a line had been crossed. And in the dead man's clenched hand, they found a small, telling clue. A tiny scrap of blue fabric, the kind used for maintenance uniforms, the faint trace of an official issue stamp still visible. That night, the investigator stopped outside Marcus's cell. The usual professional distance was gone from her voice. It was low, and it was serious. "This just escalated," she said through the bars. Marcus didn't need to respond. He understood perfectly. Crow wasn't hiding anymore. He wasn't just a ghost in the system. He was actively exposing it, pulling at threads, and the system, the real one, the one that operated in the shadows, was starting to push back with lethal force. And Marcus was standing right in the middle of it all. The signal had been sent, and now the war had begun. What do you think happens next to Marcus? Is Crow a hero or a villain? Let me know your theories in the comments below. And if you're hooked on this story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what comes next. Thanks for watching.